Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads. And today my guest is Kriston Capps. Kriston, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm a staff writer for CityLab, and I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Well, we're happy to have you. We're going to be discussing something that I think has possibly never actually been discussed on Blogging Heads before, which is architecture. But we'll also be talking about cities, transportation, some urban issues in general, uh, housing affordability, and that kind of general area of topics. And at the end, we'll hopefully talk about something nerdy in a different realm, which is comic books. Okay, so why don't we start with a piece that you wrote, which is the reason I wanted to talk to you, called There's Nothing to Fear from New York's Next Skyscraper Boom. So, can you summarize the piece and tell us why we should not be afraid?
Well, there's a lot of concern about some developments that have been taking place in Midtown. We are entering the end of the first skyscraper boom. Buildings that have been planned or have been begun even before the recession that are starting to be topped out now. We're entering into the second phase of this skyscraper boom, and these are mostly super skinny, super tall towers that are going up that are going to rival any skyscrapers that we've seen in New York City so far. These are buildings that are going to exceed One World Trade Center in height, some of them quite possibly by a lot. They're often narrow buildings. They're usually luxury condo buildings.
Hmm.
And in Midtown, those are all arrayed on what has been called, of course, derogatorily, billionaires row because of
Right.
the kind of clients who are buying these condo developments. So there's some anxiety about these buildings. One, because they're so tall. They, according to critics, block important views. They maybe block out the sky from certain ground views, and because they potentially introduce new, even wealthier residents into Manhattan, which causes some concern among residents. But I don't think it's
Right.
anything to
Right.
be afraid of.
Right. And so some of these condos, the ones on the top floors of the buildings that are still under construction and some that have recently been completed, some are selling for $90 million,
Right.
and they're breaking records seemingly every week. Some of these buildings are costing $1 billion to build and then, selling out for, or I don't know if any have actually reached more than a billion, but, they're all very profitable. And tell us about who are the people who are buying a condo for 90 or $100 million.
Well, I don't know them personally, unfortunately. I
Yeah,
don't
I've,
run
I've
in
never met I've never met any of them either.
I don't run in that circle, but these are, what you call the pied à terre. They're billionaires from around the globe. New wealth and money being created in Russia, in Brazil, in China, and the Middle East. The BRIC nation buyers, I think, are the way that I often read these billionaires as being characterized.
Mhm. So
And
brick referring to Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
that's right. Um, so the the thing is that they're not said to be living in these places. This is a residence that they might actually live in for a day or two a year. Such
Mhm.
apparently is the life of a billionaire jet setter, um, and that has people concerned. That they're not being taxed sufficiently for what they're purchasing or the changes that they are bringing to Manhattan. It's not usually the way critics express it. I never really hear critics say that they're not being taxed appropriately, but that sounds to me what the problem is that they're bringing change to Manhattan. Other Manhattanites fearful of this change, and they don't think these developments should proceed or are worthwhile.
Right. So I guess the critique is along the lines of, these super rich are building these palaces in the sky. Some of them are, they're reshaping the Manhattan skyline, which is obviously iconic. Some of them are, some of these new buildings, since they're on 57th Street, are near Central Park, and they cast shadow over the southern parts of Central Park during certain parts of the year. So, the sun is being blotted out by the penthouses of the rich. And some of these people are buying them as investment properties or trophies. They're not living in them. So these giant buildings are seemingly, some of them at least, going to be largely empty almost all of the time. And the wealthy are not contributing their fair share for what they're extracting from the city. So, I mean, what's your response to that kind of critique?
Well, those are all legitimate concerns. I think that some are a little bit more pressing than others. I mean, so you don't really want large vacant buildings, but I don't think that these are going to generate any of the problems that are usually associated with vacancy. In fact, building large towers where no one is really living full time is maybe good from the infrastructure perspective, from the impact that they're going to have on, say, the subway or the power grid.
Right. So these buildings, even though they, some of them are 100 or more stories tall, but they're a lot of them are 1 or 2 apartments per floor because they're very thin. So, some of these buildings may house at most a couple hundred people, even if everyone was actually living there.
Yeah, this is something the architect Gordon Gill told me during the interview, is that if you think of a skinny tower, well, as you go up that tower, the elevators don't get skinnier, the air shafts don't get smaller, the mechanicals that you need stay the same size. So really, after a certain height, you are talking about 1 penthouse unit per floor. So this isn't a major tax on the infrastructure. What it is that it's a lost opportunity to tax this incredible wealth. That's something that Mayor Bloomberg said when these developments first started to pop up, and there was some criticism going with it. And he said, no, this is a fantastic opportunity. What we exactly want are billionaires moving in, whom we can then tax for services that we can apply throughout the rest of the city. That means generating new infrastructure. That means creating affordable housing, developing fortifications against future Hurricane Sandys. There's all kinds of applications. It's just that property tax alone is too limited to capture the kind of tax potential that that these billionaires represent. And if I sound a little bit vampiric, I guess I just have to cop to it. I absolutely think that it's worthwhile to tax them a greater share, and that is one of the proposals that de Blasio is considering now.
Right. So they obviously pay regular New York State property taxes on the value of their homes. Right. Is there like a property tax cap or something? Is there some reason why if you buy a house for $100 million, or if people feel like the state of New York and the city of New York, which I believe also has some kind of property tax, correct me if I'm wrong, is not not getting the fair tax value out of these people?
Well, I mean, let's be fair that New Yorkers do pay very high taxes, and they generally get pretty good services back for them. I mean,
right.
The problem here is inequality more than development. These are just record levels of wealth pouring into, penthouses high up in the sky. It's not a Manhattan problem. It's, I think, a global problem about our inability to actually tax wealth where it lives. The property taxes are fine. It's the income taxes that you can't capture for someone who doesn't live in New York full time, and an ability to kind of find and implement another kind of tax that will capture that wealth that lives there.
Right. And actually, maybe I was misspeaking about New York City having its own property tax. I believe New York City has its own income tax for residents. Is that correct? That's correct.
But that wouldn't apply generally to the sort of people who are said to be buying these penthouses.
Right. And there are some absurd cases that have been reported about people who own very expensive apartments in New York City, seemingly live there as their primary residence, but try to game the system and say they actually live, in the Hamptons or something. And there's some case that I think it was in the New Yorker or something a couple of years ago, talking about some, hedge fund billionaire or something, and he very carefully kept logs where he would purposely take his helicopter out to his estate of the Hamptons to sleep at night, so it wouldn't count as a day that he was living in New York. Like, it needs to be 50% or more, something along those lines. So there's this bizarre, gaming the system of the super rich, avoiding trying to pretend they don't actually live in New York full time, even though they live in a Park Avenue penthouse or something along those lines.
Right, and this is a classic problem. This isn't a new problem that new kinds of architecture are creating, and we need solutions that can deal with people who are essentially dodging their taxes. In this case, I think that there could be inventive solutions that are fixed to the architecture, whether that is a view tax or a luxury height tax. I mean, these are ideas that
tell me about a view tax, because so for people who aren't familiar with the layout of Manhattan, these apartments are all shooting up on 57th Street, which is the last major east-west road before Central Park. And if you get the apartments on the Central Park side, you have an amazing view of Central Park unobstructed, laid out before you. And if you get them on the other side, you have an amazing view of Midtown and Lower Manhattan laid out before you. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the prime selling points for these places. And a lot of them have these giant windows, which are pretty impractical from a standpoint of actually living somewhere. But I guess if you're having your charity auction or your fancy schmancy soiree, you get to show off this amazing view for the night. So what would a view tax be?
Well, I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I mean, I just think it's the kind of idea that this is a natural resource in New York City, these incredible views, in a sense. Mm-hmm. And it's a way of looking at it. Obviously, some New Yorkers are deeply unhappy about the fact that these towers might block the sunlight at certain stretches of the day during when you're in Central Park. Now, I've never seen a rendering or any kind of development scheme that actually builds up towers so high and so densely that, in fact, the sun is blocked from Central Park. But yes, these buildings are going to cast shadows. And in a sense, people who use New Central Park, and that's every New Yorker, are paying the price for that. So I think that it's justifiable to tax the owners of these buildings who are drawing away a resource from other people in order to give back to the rest of New York. Right.
And that kind of reminds me a little bit of this whole topic of air rights, which is possibly unique to New York City, but is a kind of quirk of the zoning system. And you can explain it. If I'm saying anything wrong here, you can explain it more thoroughly. There are certain maximum heights where buildings are allowed to be built throughout Manhattan and possibly other parts of New York City. Right. Since there's such a premium on land, each in a certain zoning area, say each building is allowed, I think it's called as of right, without appealing to the city zoning board or whatever, to build a building, say up to 40 stories. And then if some real estate developer wants to build a skyscraper that's 80 stories, they can buy the air rights, the right to the unbuilt property above a certain location from the owners of those buildings. So it's just this quirk of zoning law created, it's like an economic rent, I suppose. It created, value for the owner of, say, a tenement that's 3 stories. They have this untapped wealth and they can sell it permanently to another development. And so that building that's next to or near, I think it needs to be on the same block or something like that, to the skyscrapers, permanently can't grow any higher. And they sell that to the developer, and they assemble these air rights. And there's some buildings it takes years negotiating with people who are holding out, who own small buildings, holding out for more and more money. And this can be millions of dollars for the air rights, selling something that is purely the invention of the zoning code, just because kind of the absurdity of how densely packed Manhattan has become.
Yeah, it is a testimony to how densely packed the city is and how many people want to live there. And I think what it tells us is that we're not letting as many people live there as who want to. I mean, it's a strange situation for the government to be creating completely arbitrary caps on height, and then mandating that some developers can sell them to other developers. And I just don't think that's the most efficient situation to deal with the housing crisis in New York City.
Right. And we're going to talk about kind of housing affordability and other things later. Yeah. But I also want to talk about, we talked about the economic side and kind of the political side of this. What about the aesthetic side?
Yeah.
New York City, the skyline is the most famous in America, possibly the world. It was violently reshaped by terrorists on 9/11.
Right.
Lower Manhattan is the World Trade Center site is being rebuilt. Skyscrapers are going up there. But you have the iconic Chrysler Building and Empire State Building that are in Midtown, and a number of other iconic towers. And then you have these very thin, very tall buildings going up
Right.
that are reshaping the skyline. What do you think about the aesthetics of these new towers? And do you think, that should weigh in kind of how these decisions are made about whether to allow buildings to go higher than they would be allowed zoning wise, or should the public get some kind of vote in some way about whether, this building is just hideous, it shouldn't be allowed to desecrate the skyline of New York City just so some rich people could live there 5 days a year? What do you think about that side of it?
I think this is where I diverge from a lot of architecture critics. Actually, I don't see a crisis here. I can't say that I love all of the buildings that I've seen, and that's not, of course, all of the buildings that have been built or are going to be built. And I don't know them, intimately yet. I haven't been inside some of these projects, but I can say that from the outside, I think that there's a lot of innovation happening. Shop Architects, the architecture firm that designed the Barclays Center, that is redesigning that is developing the Domino Sugar Factory site in Brooklyn, does really, really wonderful work. And at the project that they're doing on 57th Street is a super skinny, tall building with kind of terracotta siding that calls back to the original artisans working in New York. It's made, the terracotta is made in New York State. So not all
really?
of these.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lot of buildings like this. Even I think, frankly, some of the ones I don't love. That adds to the texture of the city. And I think that worrying to the point of stopping development is not really the way that New York architecture became as famous as it is. It's not the way that Chicago architecture has become as powerful as it is. It is the way that DC architecture has developed, where we have a very serious height act mandated by Congress, and we don't build towers, and we don't always have architects of global significance coming here to build buildings in our nation's capital. So I don't see a problem aesthetically. I think some of these projects are totally wonderful. 432 Park is a building that I initially thought was dreadful, but it's really growing on me, and it's actually growing on me because of conversations I've had since I wrote a story about some of these projects. And I think the same thing.
We will include links to images of some of these projects that we're talking about in the links below this video. So why don't you tell us a little bit about 432 Park, which is, I guess, kind of the second one of these giant thin buildings to be constructed, and it has topped out and is definitely noticeable on the New York City skyline, and has very austere or very kind of regimented architectural style. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's one of the buildings that looks, it reminds me, and I think some other peoples, of the kind of architecture that went into the original World Trade Center. It's this building that looks modular, like it could rise into the sky forever. Like the end of it, might just never happen. It would just rise into the clouds and continue on to the moon. And that kind of super modernist modularity is really attractive. At first, I thought it was a little bit too modern, I might say, but I don't know. I had a lot of conversations with people and was sort of won over by the fact. I think it's something that could last. It could be an important contribution to New York skyline.
Right. So it's a little hard to just talk about these things when we can't have an image. So again, images will be linked. So it's basically a cube that is, goes up like 104 stories or possibly more, with evenly spaced square windows. So it almost looks like a child's drawing of a building, extended to a, almost absurd amount. Possibly it is an absurd amount, and it's currently kind of the only super tall building in that area. and really kind of sticks out. I haven't seen it in person, but just seen photographs of it under construction on the skyline. I like it less than you do. Maybe it'll grow on me. It seems kind of too impersonal to me. Obviously, that's a
Yeah.
huge. With skyscrapers, it's very hard to have a skyscraper that where monumentalism doesn't take over. But it's not my cup of tea. I guess I'll wait till it's finally finished. You can see images of it topped out, but they're still constructing the inside of it. And the shop one, this is, maybe they started the construction, but they've released the renderings of it. I agree that one looks really interesting. It seems thinner than 432, and
Yes.
they're doing a lot more with the exterior of it to make it interesting to look at. And what do you think of the Gehry Tower in Lower Manhattan? That was, I think, maybe the first at the time. I think when it was finished, it was the tallest apartment building in Manhattan.
Yeah, I think you mean 88 Spruce Street. Yeah.
Yeah, Spruce Street.
Right. Yeah, I love that project. I would have never thought about it favorably, just looking at renderings, because I remember when that building was kind of coming up, there was a lot of discussion about how the apartments are going to be looking into one another's windows. And I mean, I had never seen a Gehry project, a residential project of this kind of scale.
Yeah, I think it's his first skyscraper.
Right, right.
And his first major project in Manhattan as well. So this building, it has been around for a couple of years. It appears, on sitcoms that are set in New York City, and when they show the shot of the skyline to change scenes, this building is popping up. It's very prominent in Lower Manhattan, and I think it's fantastic. I have seen that one in person, and I think it shows the potential for great architects who are designing skyscrapers where the technology of modeling has changed, and buildings can just be built in much different ways than they used to. So that one makes me optimistic. Some of the other ones make me a little more pessimistic, but I agree that I think it's an exciting time, especially if you kind of are an architecture fan. There's a lot of interesting stuff that's going to come online, and it's going to happen inevitably. There's just too much money. There's really no way to stop it, and fighting over individual buildings, you could affect it somehow or make it a little shorter. But I don't know. This kind of seems inevitable.
Well,
you just have to hope for the aesthetics, that the aesthetics will be, they'll do a good job, and it won't be something that everyone hates 5 years from now. Because these buildings, once they're built, they hopefully will never be torn down, at least in the way that the World Trade Center was. But a giant skyscraper is going to stay there for a number of years.
It is going to stay there for a number of years, and they're going to weather economic crises. There are going to be, future financial disasters. There's always a lot of speculation that this market that we're in is a terrible bubble that will ruin everything. And when that happens, these buildings will find other uses. So I think that they are going to serve as an important testimony. I was just trying to look up, the developer of 432 Park, because I forgot his name is Vignoli, and Vignoli's projects have been controversial, just like Gehry's projects have been controversial. But I think both of these so far are really going to stand up as important, not just important examples of their own work, but sort of important symbols for this time. We look back at the Chrysler Building, at the Empire State Building, at Mies van der Rohe in Chicago. We look at these buildings as really emblematic of specific moments in American history, and I think that these buildings are going to do the same. And that is, for better or for worse, Billionaires Row is always going to mean something about this particular time in history. And I don't think that's something we should shy away from.
Right. Yeah. Certainly, that's interesting. These works reflect our values, our economic values, our aesthetic values.
Right.
I think sometimes they show things about America and commerce that people don't like, and that's part of why people react to them negatively. So speaking of reacting to a building negatively, the New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman reviewed One World Trade Center. So people probably have seen images of this building. It is mostly complete, and some tenants are moving in. This was the tallest building rebuilt on the site formerly known as Ground Zero, and some people still call it that.
Yeah.
and Michael Kimmelman really ripped it apart. Uh, he did not like One World Trade Center at all. So, what do you think of One World Trade Center, and what did you think of what Kimmelman had to say about it?
Well, I don't think anyone was surprised that Kimmelman didn't like this building. This
Right.
building has been, coming up for a really long time, and kind of built in many ways by committee over time. So there weren't any surprises going into it. The changes weren't last minute, and so when it was finished, there was a feeling, I think, as much of resignation as of appreciation. And that's
Right.
what Kimmelman, I think, really captures very well. The sense that, there was an important moment. It was an important moment for architecture. It was an important moment for New York City. It was an important moment for America. And maybe we didn't grab it. Maybe we did not take a hold of that moment and decide on the kind of statement that we felt like we should be making from the very beginning.
Right.
And that is, a result of a kind of planning by committee approach, and the kind of development that project was maybe inevitably going to be. Kimmelman says that it's a wonderful building interior from the interior perspective, if I recall his review correctly, and I think that speaks to David Child's work and SOM's work as architects. They know what they're doing. This wasn't a mistake by design, but a mistake by execution and implementation. The building itself, I haven't seen the interiors and can't judge them, but I think I share the frustration that Kimmelman expresses and that a lot of New Yorkers feel in that it looks it's too plain for what the city needed to express and what I think a lot of America wanted to express in that tower.
Right.
It doesn't compare very favorably with the original World Trade Center towers. Maybe that was inevitable because that was such a powerful statement to take a really kind of profoundly modernist tower and to do it twice. I don't know.
Right, and some would say that was the only saving grace of the original World Trade Center. If there was just one of them, it would have been totally absurd. But the fact that there was two of them is what made it work in some ways, although it was many people hated it when it was first built.
For sure.
Many people continued to hate it and really only came to miss it, obviously, after it was destroyed on 9/11. And there's definitely a lot of nostalgia for it, but there was a lot of things wrong with it. There's a book whose title I can't remember, but I will link to, that's a history of the building of the World Trade Center and the whole process of clearing that area by the Port Authority. And it's a really bizarre story how it came to be. And it wasn't what was intended at all. And the fact that a government agency owned it, owned the land and built the tower themselves, the Port Authority, which if you live in New York or New Jersey, you've heard of, and Governor Christie has had some problems with things that are happening in the Port Authority. Right. But basically, they were originally the ports of Elizabeth and Newark and New York City and Brooklyn. They had to have some kind of governing authority to share them. So it kind of morphed into this giant agency. And there's, of course, what's the title of that book about the Halberstam book, The Power Broker. There's also the history of, even before 9/11, the history of the Port Authority and the construction of the World Trade Center and all this stuff is totally insane. So I'm sure there will be a great book written about how these buildings came to be. But I agree. It's obviously the design was super compromised. If you look at what the architect who did the site plan, whose name is escaping me right now, originally conceived, it's really totally different from that. I think it does make a statement. Yeah, it does. It makes a statement in height. I think it is an aesthetically pleasing object. There's been a ton of compromises, and even mid-construction, there were compromises about the base. Right. They originally, the engineers who built this must be so upset that they did this thing that must have been incredibly difficult to have a base that started off smaller and tapered upwards, and this whole 100-story tower is on this base that tapers upward. That must have been incredibly difficult to design, and they covered it up with these reflective panels because they couldn't get it to work correctly.
Right.
So it ends in a giant cube kind of instead of a tapered shape, and the original top to the building, the spire was also because of money reasons. They didn't want to spend the extra money to cover the spire as the architect originally intended. So I kind of have this fantasy that 20 or 50 years from now, there's gonna be a campaign to restore the original vision of One World Trade Center, and they'll undo the base and add in the spire that was originally intended, the way they sometimes do with buildings that were kind of botched or that had additions added onto them, that took away the original glory. So I feel like at some point these mistakes might be corrected, and we'll actually see what David Childs wanted. But for all of it, I think it does work pretty well. And I think the other buildings, called 2, 3, and 4 World Trade Center,
Right.
are even better, and hopefully they will all be built. One is already completed, one just restarted, and one they're thinking will be built at some point. It's like the land is too valuable. At some point they'll build it. Hopefully it goes to the original plans. But I think once the whole site is completed, I think it really will be very good and better than what was there before 9/11.
Yeah, one of the things that Kimmelman mentions, and I think it's true, is that this is a lost opportunity to make that building the core of a neighborhood.
Right.
And that's kind of it at attention with what it needs to be, or what it wants to be symbolically, and as a statement of resilience, is that actually it is a part of the neighborhood, and a neighborhood that is that aspires to be more of a neighborhood than it was, a decade ago. And so maybe that is
right.
something.
And so the original creating the original World Trade Center, they took a whole neighborhood and basically erased it from the map. Took the streets off of the street grid and created this thing called a super block. And that kind of helped. That was a kind of way of designing skyscrapers and urban planning that was popular in kind of the 50s and 60s, and came to be seen as a giant mistake.
Right.
And they've taken some steps by reconnecting Greenwich Street and trying to make it reintegrate to the neighborhood. So one of the streets that was erased, part of it was taken off the street grid. They've opened it back up again, and hopefully, obviously, there's a lot of security concerns. Hopefully, it will become a real street once again. But yeah, I mean, if we send our minds back 2 or 3 years and remember the awful debate about the Ground Zero Mosque, so called, you can just think about how much emotion is in this site, and it literally is the place where thousands of people were killed and their bodies were never recovered. There's people are going to be mad. There's no way you could have pleased anyone, or even the majority of people.
No.
Whatever happens there, and maybe it'll take a number of years for it all to be completed. Do you have anything else you want to say about the World Trade Center site or buildings in New York in general before we move on to another topic?
Well, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people have already said, is that I'm surprised that so many firms did such a good job with the museum. I think the 9/11 museum is a really tasteful project.
Right. Yeah, and I haven't been there yet. I've seen the museum from the outside. It's obviously, again, controversial because there's been so much bizarre controversy, about showing images of the hijackers, or just talking about U.S. foreign policy, and they wanted to have a cultural center at one point here, and of course, if you have a cultural center, you might someday have an artist who says something not so nice about America, and putting that at a site where 3,000 people were murdered. So there's all sorts of sensitivities here. But have you actually been to the museum?
I haven't been there yet, but I worked for an architecture magazine and managed to get a lot of layout design and photos, and was impressed with the kind of scope and some of the specific decisions they made with the interior. So I do need to kind of caution my statement that I might change my mind, but I was just impressed from what I have seen with what they did.
Right, and I'll actually link to an interesting article I read on BuzzFeed that was written by someone whose sibling was killed on 9/11, and it's their experience of going to the museum and being around tourists at this place where this incredibly awful thing happened, and it's just a very interesting take. And the museum itself is usually we don't make a museum about an event that happened 10 years ago. Usually it takes 50 or 100 years to
Right.
make a museum. And, the effects of what happened on 9/11 are obviously still, uh, uh, coming out, and the story hasn't been totally written yet. So having a museum is very unusual, but everything about this site is very unusual from its very creation.
Right.
Okay, why don't we move on to things that don't involve New York City? Although housing affordability is obviously a topic that people in New York City are very concerned about because it's one of the most expensive areas of the country to live in. So there was a study that came out a month or two ago, and I think it was Trulio, which is a website that for real estate, and they did a ranking of the most affordable metro areas in the United States. And I think it was pitched towards millennials, so it was looking at places where I think it took like the average income of millennials compared to the average cost of a mortgage to buy a house in that area,
Right.
and said like what percentage of the houses could the average millennial making the average millennial's income afford. And they ranked it, we got the top 10, so the most affordable, and the bottom 10, so the least affordable. So the least affordable are places where it's not really surprising. San Francisco is the least affordable, followed by, and this is the entire metro area, not just the city, I believe, followed by Los Angeles, San Diego, New York, and Orange County, and San Jose, which is Silicon Valley, I assume. And then, so the most affordable area of the country for millennials, Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
I've driven through Dayton, Ohio. It didn't seem like a very nice place.
Right.
Number 2 is where I live, Rochester, New York. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. And then the rest of the top 10 are Akron, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, Toledo, Ohio, Birmingham, Alabama, Kansas City, Camden, New Jersey, Columbia, South Carolina, and Detroit, Michigan.
Right.
So obviously in the top 5, we have 3 Rust Belt cities in Ohio that are not exactly places where millennials are swarming. We have Gary, Indiana, which is kind of, and along with Camden and Detroit, are kind of well-known basket case cities where, Camden and Gary are kind of the places near Philadelphia and Chicago where a lot of poor people live, kind of like New Jersey is to New York City, and some cities, Columbia and Birmingham in the south. Kansas City is the biggest city among these 10, I believe, although maybe Detroit is bigger than Kansas City. Right. Kansas City is really the only city that I would say has any kind of, people are aiming to move to Kansas City anyway at all. And I live in Rochester, New York, where I live. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and Rochester, New York. But what did you make of this? And Derek Thompson wrote a very interesting piece in The Atlantic, your colleague, about this, comparing this list with Dayton, Ohio at the top, with the list of places where it's easiest to move between economic classes or have the most social mobility. And number 1 on that list is San Francisco, which I'll remind you is also the least affordable metro area in the country. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, these are complicated metrics. I can tell you this much, that millennials who are living in Dayton, Ohio, or places like Gary, Indiana, may not necessarily feel like they're getting the greatest value. I don't think that there's a widespread sentiment that Rust Belt cities are totally overlooked gems, and that is to say nothing bad about Rust Belt cities, but just that there are other factors that come into play. One, housing alone isn't the end of this story. Obviously, job opportunity is what is driving so many people to San Francisco, where you have just about perfect full employment. Transportation costs are another huge factor.
And San Francisco, like New York City, is also very a place where it's very hard to imagine a lot of new construction happening just geographically, because it's kind of a peninsula and Manhattan is an island. There's only so much new construction that you can imagine, even if there weren't all these problems about zoning and NIMBYs, which is people who say not in my backyard, who don't want the skyscraper built down the block from them. So both, and Washington D.C. also has these constraints about height. So that's kind of one of the overarching themes of a lot of economics writers like Matt Iglesias in recent years have been, the places where the economy is really hot are also the places that have these severe constraints on building new housing.
Yeah, they do have severe geographic constraints because you can't build more Manhattan. You can't
Right.
actually build
Well,
San Francisco.
they did one time in Battery Park City, but
right. There is. They're okay. You can. It's quite expensive.
Yes, you could imagine some kind of spectacular project that added to the landmass of Manhattan, but that seems more difficult than changing zoning laws.
But you can also just make all of these places much, much denser. The problem, as you mentioned, is that there is no reason for incumbent homeowners to vote for those kinds of changes. If you live in a very nice neighborhood in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and say you've lived there for years and you don't want to see the culture change, then you want to vote against radical or just large new developments. But you don't even have to live there for years. You could just have bought a house in San Francisco in 2011, and maybe you still don't want to see large new developments. And
right,
the people who live there and own homes have incredible sway over who can move into these places. So while it's true, you can't build more San Francisco, you can't build more New York, more Manhattan, you can build a lot more on top of these places. You can build a much, much smaller units, which might offend a certain kind of American sensibility. We don't like to think of people living in micro apartments, or maybe find that distasteful from this kind of instinctual reaction. But I don't think that it needs to be. Americans really, really don't want to live like people in Singapore or Hong Kong who live in very high density developments. But that is only one perspective. Maybe if you're a millennial and you want to live in San Francisco, maybe you're willing to live in a very, very tiny apartment with a lot of shared amenities so that you can take advantage of the fact that you don't have to own a car in order to get to work every day.
Right.
That's one of the truths that is sometimes eluded by these comparative measures about what market is more expensive than what other market. The fact is that you don't need a car in San Francisco makes it much more affordable for the people who can afford to live there. If that makes if that makes sense. Whereas in Indianapolis,
there's a hidden subsidy in cities like San Francisco, New York, Washington, Boston. There's not that many of them, unfortunately, in America, where you can get along without a car. But just that fact that you don't have to have a car and you don't have to pay for a place to put the car makes it easier to imagine a development of an apartment building that isn't very big but has 50 apartments and no parking spaces attached to it, where young people would maybe want to live.
Right, but and it's sometimes difficult to convince people who live in places like New York and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. that what makes it so wonderful are the things that they're voting against.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and there's an eternal joke about New York that, when people move there, that's the New York they want to recapture. And New York is always changing. And so they don't want anything that would make that New York different, and are always complaining about anything new.
Right.
I guess, parking, minimum parking requirements for a lot of developments are another kind of zoning law that is super boring, and no presidential candidate is ever going to run on the platform of repealing minimum parking requirements. And of course, it's a municipal issue, not a federal one. But something like that that's so mind-numbingly dull, really has a huge impact on new construction and what is affordable. And if you need a giant surface parking lot or to build an underground garage, which is super expensive in a new development. So there are all these kind of little hidden issues that when you look at them, the people who care most about them are incumbents and developers, and the average person, who I'm sure the average person who's thinking about affording whether or not they can afford a house is not thinking about minimum parking requirements. But these things have huge a really big impact, and there has been a lot of there's a growing. I mean, the fact that I know about this at all, and I'm not a professional planner, indicates that if you want to learn about this more you can. And there have been fights about this. The place where I used to live in Ithaca had a big fight. College Town, which is where all the students of Cornell University hang out, and where a lot of student housing is, there was a huge fight about a new apartment building to get a variance so they wouldn't have to build a parking lot next to it.
Right.
I think it eventually succeeded, but the people who own homes in College Town, the people who are not college students, it's obviously aggravating if you can never find a parking spot on the street because the college students are always there. And I used to live near College Town in Ithaca, and it was aggravating. If you wanted to go to a restaurant, it's very hard to find parking. But of course, lots of people wanted to be there, and no one goes there anymore. It's too crowded, kind of thing. But these fights continue and are important, even though seemingly boring.
Yeah, they're super important, and it's also one of these things where it's like it only tells you half the picture to talk about parking requirements. Another way to think about parking requirements is that it's putting fewer drivers on the road. If you can't park your car easily at your apartment building, maybe some of those people who move in won't have cars at all, or they'll sell them before they move to New York City or some other coastal city. I like to think of Austin as a really good example. That's where I used to live. That's where I went to college. It's a wonderful town, as everybody knows. But it's becoming really, really difficult to navigate. People sit every single day in absolute parking lots on the highway. And part of the reason is because they continue to build and grow, but have taken no measures to remove the roads and replace them with public transit and expect people to take public transit. It is still very much car culture that is kind of shoehorned into a really lovely urban kind of dynamic. And I'm sad to say, and I think a lot of residents will confirm that it's ruining Austin. That doesn't mean Austin is ruined, but it is making the quality of life worse for residents, and they're going to have to make decisions that may inconvenience them now, but save them a lot of grief and a lot of time commuting in the long run.
Right. Yeah, I didn't know that about Boston. I always thought Boston was a good transit city. There's not that many cities that have a really workable subway system.
I might have sounded like Boston, but I was talking about Austin, Texas.
Oh, Austin. I'm sorry, Austin, Texas.
Yeah,
that makes a lot more sense. Does Austin does not have any sort of light rail or anything like that?
No, they just shot down a light rail proposal that was controversial. They are working on a bus network, but it's slow. It's all slow compared to the growth of the city. And Austin's not alone like that either.
Yeah, and I mean, the cities where subway systems were built at the turn of the 20th century are the East Coast cities are already very built up, and of course the cities in the Sun Belt and cities in California were developed during the interstate highway system era, and New York City and Boston and Philadelphia and cities like that benefited from being having these systems already in place once we began to see how great they are and how much urban highways and driving all the time really hurts city life and suburban life, because the people who come into work in the city need to get there somehow. I want to talk briefly about my adopted hometown of Rochester, New York.
Right? That's one of the
number two. The second, if you don't want to live in Ohio, this is the place to be if you want housing affordability, according to Trulia.
And how affordable is it?
It is shockingly affordable.
Okay.
So So if I say Rochester, New York to you, what do you think of?
I'm probably thinking it's maybe upstate a little ways on a commuter train line.
No, you are wrong. So you, like many
totally
people in America, know nothing about Rochester, New York. You know nothing of my work. So Rochester's in Western New York. It's closer to Cleveland, Ohio, than it is to New York City.
Okay.
It's between Buffalo and Syracuse. It's on the Erie Canal. It was founded originally. It's at the junction of a river called the Genesee and the Erie Canal. Once the Erie Canal was built, Rochester became local Rochester people like to call Rochester America's first boom town, because there was a huge boom in like milling flour and stuff like that once the Erie Canal became established. So Rochester, I think, people of the generation older than you and me, Rochester, New York, to them means Eastman Kodak.
Uh-huh.
So George Eastman lived in Rochester. I didn't know that much about him before I moved here. He was really kind of on the level of Henry Ford in importance to industrialization and uh, automation and the motion picture industry and personal cameras are because of Eastman Kodak. So
Right.
Eastman Kodak was a huge employer in Rochester. At its peak, it employed 60,000 people locally, and at its peak, the city of Rochester population was around 350,000 or so. Today, Eastman Kodak obviously went through bankruptcy and emerged. Today, I think around 4,000 or fewer people are employed locally
Okay.
by Eastman Kodak.
Okay.
So that's like 95% drop. So that was a huge
Yeah.
blow to the city. And two other titans of American industry were also found in Rochester, which are Xerox and Bausch and Lomb. They both have kind of residual headquarters here, and both of those kind of grew up with Kodak also because Xerox is obviously involved in imaging and Bausch and Lomb lenses. So Rochester at some point was trying to position itself as the imaging city with these three giant companies. Both of those are a lot smaller than they used to be. Bausch and Lomb was bought by another company. Xerox is no longer primarily located in Rochester. So anyway, so Rochester, in 1950 was apparently a great place to live. It was still inexpensive. If you worked for Eastman Kodak, apparently when bonus season came at Eastman Kodak, it was like Ford in Detroit or Ford and GM.
Right.
When bonus season came, everyone went out and went shopping that day, and it was like the best day of the year in the city for businesses and everyone involved because everyone worked at Kodak, their relatives worked at Kodak, or they knew someone who worked at Kodak. So all of that is gone. This is a story that a lot of cities are dealing with. The big manufacturing companies are drastically downsized, and now Rochester is currently the second most affordable place to live in the country. When we kind of ended, my wife and I kind of ended up here accidentally because she was in graduate school and in Ithaca and got a job in outside of Rochester, and we moved here. And because I work for Blogging Heads, I can work remotely. When I first moved here, I wasn't very excited about it, but it's actually a really nice city. It's a third tier city. About 215,000 people live in the city, and but more in the greater metro area. It is very, very affordable. My wife and I were lucky enough to buy a house about a month and a half ago in an inner ring suburb called Irondequoit, and it was we now pay less in New York State taxes, which are kind of high, and our mortgage than we did renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Rochester itself.
Huh.
We probably paid about 1/5 the cost of buying a studio apartment in New York City.
Right.
It's just absurd how cheap it is, and obviously truly agrees. So I would make that pitch to young millennials who want to move somewhere. As long as you don't care about cold weather, the weather is really awful, and obviously there was this freak snowstorm outside of Buffalo a month ago, and that kind of thing can happen. And winter lasts from about November to May. But other than that, it's a pretty good place to live. And I think kind of we mentioned before, these Rust Belt cities like Dayton and Akron and Gary. I think there is a chance they could start to come back. As young people are just not going to be able to live in New York City and San Francisco, working a kind of menial job at current prices. If you want to if you have small children, or if you have a pet and you'd like a backyard, moving to a place, a smaller city, definitely has a lot of advantages. And there's actually some interesting things. I don't want to go down a Rochester rabbit hole, but I'll briefly mention that in the 1950s they built what's called the Inner Loop, which was a highway that's alternately elevated and sunken below street level around the central business district. This was the kind of thing that was built in many cities in the 50s, 60s era. It was a huge mistake and destroyed a lot of neighborhoods. And it's kind of been like a noose around downtown for 20 or 30 years. And they're actually filling in a portion of it in a $20 million project. So they're taking it back to being just regular surface streets with surface parking, not a highway.
Uh-huh.
So there are some interesting projects in Rochester itself this is kind of a movement among other cities that have federal highways or state highways built through them during the urban renewal era, trying to figure out what do we do with this highway that ruined neighborhoods, often poor neighborhoods, because those were had the least political power and couldn't fight their houses being torn down for a highway. There's a highway in Syracuse where the same kind of fight is happening. So
Right.
I think there are some positive things happening in Rochester city planning that I think would make it a good place for any young person who wants to come live. And as I said before, very affordable.
One of the things I feel like, I obviously don't know Rochester. I've learned a lot, and I'm curious to investigate more. One of the things I feel like some Rust Belt cities suffer from is something I think of as the pitchfork problem. The internet gave us this great access to music and made it possible to publish music blogs and come up with new kinds of publications for discussing music. And yet, so many years later, we sort of have one. We have Pitchfork, which is the kind of the tastemaker and kingmaker and dragon slayer. And then you have, some smaller, more niche-oriented blogs. But what we had, I think, before the internet was actually a more diverse series of music magazines than what we have today. And I think of that when I think about employers who feel that they need to headquarter in San Francisco or in New York City, even though the internet has given us like greater tools to conduct business anywhere in the world at any time from virtually any place. And none of these decisions are being made about, because of natural resources. It's not something peculiar to San Francisco geography that requires all of Silicon Valley to kind of be anchored there. And my hope, I think, is for employers to maybe give up that race. I don't know how you accomplish that. I don't know if it's on the horizon or even feasible, but were cities to say, hey, if we headquarter in Rochester, if we headquarter in Cleveland or in Detroit, as you've seen Quicken Loans do, then we can buy really impressive real estate very cheaply, and we can bring families here and get them set up in downtown urban centers or whatever it is. I think revitalization has to be led by employment, and that's what the internet kind of promised us everywhere, and it hasn't yet delivered.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What that makes me think is that I'm an example of someone who has a job where I telecommute at Blogging Heads,
right?
And that has been super helpful for living somewhere that's not the media capital or the political capital of the country,
right?
And obviously, this is a trend that lots of people, and telecommuting is slowly growing. I think it will continue to grow, and I think it's a really good thing. And the other thing is that it used to be if you wanted to make it, you went to New York. But now you can make it in front of your computer. You can become a YouTube star. I mean, obviously this is kind of cliche, but you don't need to be in the place to make it anymore. And there's not that many YouTube stars, but you can kind of see how I don't want to sound like Tom Friedman, but the internet empowers people who live in places that aren't the place. So I don't live in New York City, but I'm still able to have this conversation with you living in Washington.
Right.
And I'm still able to be connected to things that happen in New York City. I'm able to look at websites and blogs and message boards about New York City real estate and architecture in New York City, which is one of a pet interest of mine.
Right.
I could never do that 20 years ago. Keep tabs on buildings under construction in New York City if I was living 6 hours away. So and obviously the internet also allows local groups to coalesce more. There's a really interesting website. Anyone, any of our viewers who happen to be in Rochester, a site called Rochester Subway, because one of the fun facts about Rochester is that it was the smallest city in America to ever have a subway, and also the smallest city in America ever to get rid of its subway. So the original path that the Erie Canal went through downtown Rochester was rerouted around 1910 to go south of the city, and they built a subway system through the old Erie Canal riverbed, and it went right through downtown. It actually went over the old aqueduct that the Erie Canal cut through the center of the city.
Huh.
And so the subway existed for 30 or 40 years, and then they decided to get rid of it, and they built a highway where the subway used to be. So now Interstate 490 cuts through the center of Rochester and goes along the old path of the Erie Canal. You can actually see some of the old stone locks of the original Erie Canal on the side of this highway. So a local guy who was interested in this history started this website, Rochester Subway, and it kind of became like the urban, kind of not Gothamist exactly, but an urban a collection for people who are interested in Rochester and transit and trying to get people to ride the bus, which is this is one of the downsides of living here is that there's not great public transit. There's a local joke that everything is 15 minutes away from everything else, but you have to drive a car. And if you don't own a car, you're stuck riding the bus. That's a definite downside, and it's hard for a city of this size to have a really great public transit system. But this guy basically started a blog, and not a professional guy. I think he's a graphic designer, and he ended up starting a nonprofit based off of this blog called Reconnect Rochester that is trying to work to improve transit options in the city. And this all of this never could have happened without the internet. So it makes me optimistic about cities like Rochester, and all obviously the internet has just disrupted a lot of things, but and hurt a lot of industries. But it makes me optimistic about the future anyway.
Me too.
Okay, so we've actually almost at the end of our time. I briefly mentioned comic books at the beginning. I would like to talk to you a little bit about comics, if anyone is still listening. So I used to read comics when I was a kid. I kind of dropped out and haven't read in a long time. You've written a lot about comics. So what would you recommend for someone like me who used to read, the old 90s Marvel and wanted to get back into it? What's a good comic coming out now? And also what for someone who has heard about comics and graphic novels, but has never read one, what's something that's kind of new that they should check out if they want to get interested in comics?
Well, so it's a really difficult time, actually, I think, for comics. It's a good time, but it's also hard. The companies are making decisions that they wouldn't have made back when you were reading and back when, I was so in love with comic books. These days, in the Marvel Comics universe, it's there's a very fast progression between these kind of cataclysmic events. It's like every week is a different crossover. So you lurch from like one large crisis to another where like there are no more mutants, and then we get the mutant back, and everyone's a Skrull, and then for
people who never read comics, the idea of the crossover is to get you to buy. Let's say you usually just read X-Men. The idea of the crossover is that to get the full story, you also have to buy Avengers. You have to pay more than you usually do if you just read one comic to get the entire story. That's the economic idea behind having a crossover, and it's a way to bring characters together who normally don't interact with each other, but it's also very mercenary, to get the little kids who are spending their pocket money on comics to buy more of them.
My friends debate about this a lot, about the wisdom of this particular approach. But these days, in Marvel Comics and in DC Comics, the big two companies, I'm going to kind of talk about those since I know those a little bit better than the independent presses. Mm-hmm. Comic books never rise to issue number 100 or issue number 453. Everything is told in kind of shorter bursts, which is good from like a consumer perspective because I wait for the comic issues to finish, and they come out in a kind of single book format, a trade paperback. There are probably some behind me on this shelf, probably a lot. And then you can kind of like get one whole story arc that way. They kind of suffer, I think, for a lack of real character development in this approach. It's a kind of postmodern artifact, but they don't tell stories so much anymore as they kind of review them. Like when Iron Man and Captain America square off in a series that's going to be the subject of I think the next Captain America movie. you already know who Iron Man is, and you already know who Captain America is, and they just kind of throw all of these heroes at each other, and you know who they are, but there aren't any longer, or just, they're just not very usual where you have these kind of serial comics that just explore characters' lives for really long running arcs. The exceptions are Invincible and The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead, probably everyone here has heard of. Invincible is it's a comic by the same creator, Robert Kirkman, and it's like a crossover between Spider-Man and Superman, like those characters combined, like a really young, kind of hip, not perfect Superman character, and it tells his ongoing adventures, and I love them for that kind of serial quality. So I will say that if you're just starting to get into this, like, you know, two things. If you have an iPad and you don't mind reading comic books that way, Marvel has a really, really great app where you can just go through the backlogs of the universe.
Oh, really?
That's cool. Yeah. And the Marvel Unlimited app is just a totally wonderful treasure trove. DC has not developed one yet, and no one can come up with a good explanation why. But if you're if you want to really follow what's being done now, I think it makes the most sense to follow creators. Find an artist you love and just follow them from book to book to book. These creators aren't loyal, really. They kind of like move back and forth between lots of things. But Mark Waid has done this Daredevil run that I think is just totally awesome. And I would have never read Daredevil as a kid because I thought he was kind of boring. But I'll follow the creator instead and watch him do things with characters maybe I never really considered before.
Cool. That's great. And there's kind of an economic explanation, of course, for the fact that when I was a kid, when I was a boy, Uncanny X-Men was in the 300s and Spider-Man was in the 400s, and that gave you a real sense that when you were reading something, like, this was a world, this had this established run, and there were these legendary issues of the past, and every time there'd be if you got to issue 350, it'd be like a big thing. But of course, for someone who'd never read comics before, someone who's young, it's also kind of intimidating, and why would they pick up something as number 367 when they haven't read it before? So that there's this economic reason for constant rebooting, but it also kind of removes some of the sense of history, and the long the long existence of these characters kind of gets continually erased just for economic reasons.
I mean, the other great way to read comic book these days is just go to the movie theater. Honestly, they're adapting things I never would have thought that they would have adapted. Like, if you had told me when I was a kid they were going to make the Infinity Gauntlet into a movie, well, I wouldn't have believed it. And now they are. They're trying to develop these whole universes. The interesting thing is that that's having an effect on the way they make the comic books themselves. Some people say that Marvel Comics, for example, is phasing out the characters who are not making the characters for whom they do not have the licenses to make.
Right, I've heard that.
Movies.
So Fantastic Four is an example of that. So Marvel there was a number of years where Marvel never made any movies. There was obviously the Batman and Superman movies in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and there weren't any. There were a couple random characters who got movies, but none of the big marquee Marvel characters were made into a movie until X-Men, which was the late 90s, I think. And then the Spider-Man movies and Avengers and Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, all these marquee characters from Marvel started getting made, but some of them they had made deals back in the day. Fantastic Four is kind of a legendary one because they made some kind of schlocky movie that was never actually released. So some other studio or individuals got the rights to these things, and there was a Fantastic Four movie. They're rebooting it again, which is kind of the absurd, the ultimate absurdity of rebooting a movie that came out in like 2003. Marvel doesn't own the rights to the revenue streams from the Fantastic Four, who were the original Marvel superhero team that Stan Lee created in the early 60s. So I guess the series got canceled, even though it was like, at one point it was the longest running Marvel superhero comic, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And actually it's really good right now. So it's being canceled when they're trying to do interesting things. And no, it's never been never been a super popular book, but they're canceling it right as a movie is coming out. There's obviously some market appetite for Fantastic Four, and especially with a movie coming in, that seems like an easy tie-in for Marvel to make. And that is the answer why they're canceling it, because they don't want to make that tie-in. It doesn't earn them anything now, especially with the company being owned by Disney. It seems suspicious.
Yeah, so I think I sense a theme that ties together the two parts of our conversation, which is that art and commerce are inextricably linked. Whether you're talking about comic books or skyscrapers, you can't escape either way.
Always.
Okay, well, Kriston, this has been really great, really fascinating. I hope our viewers enjoyed something that was a little bit different than our usual programming, and I hope to have you on again sometime soon.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye.